After defeating England, a nation whose government it viewed as tyrannical, Americans were reluctant to grant great powers to its own central government. The Articles of Confederation, the first government of the United States, reflected this reluctance. Under the Articles, there was no executive, that is, no president, and no national court system. A one-house Congress with equal representation existed, but it had no power to tax or enforce the laws it passed. The central government also was unable to require fulfillment of any obligations it entered into with foreign nations. Passage of laws required a supermajority. These and other restrictions made the first government of the United States weak and ineffectual. Severe economic troubles produced radical economic and political movements such as Shays' Rebellion, an armed insurrection by farmers in western Massachusetts against the state government. Debt-ridden farmers, struck by the economic depression that followed the American Revolution, petitioned the state Senate to issue paper money and to halt foreclosure of mortgages on their property and their own imprisonment for debt as a result of high land taxes. Sentiment was particularly high against the commercial interests who controlled the state Senate in Boston. When the state Senate failed to undertake reform, armed insurgents under the leadership of Daniel Shays and others began forcibly to prevent the county courts from sitting to make judgments for debt. In September, they forced the state Supreme Court at Springfield to adjourn. State forces were raised and sent in to repel an attack on a federal arsenal in the state. Over several months, battles between Shays' forces and both state and private forces were waged until the rebels were eventually forced to disperse, some fleeing to other states and territories. The monetary schemes of the states brought floods of paper money, which some of the states, notably Rhode Island, attempted to force creditors to accept. The threat to economic stability alarmed the wealthy conservative class. The merchants, who disliked the state taxes on imports, were also harassed by the impossibility of making stable agreements with English merchants. They were anxious to have a stronger federal government to guarantee order and property rights. The men who had money invested in Western territories also favored a stronger federal government controlling the territories. Therefore, agitation for the adoption of a stronger national government grew in force. After failed attempts to hold national conferences to resolve trade and navigation disagreements between the states, a call was issued to convene a general convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, to meet at Philadelphia in May 1787. Notice was sent to Congress, but the new convention was launched as an extra-legal body. Cautious congressional endorsement came only after 5 states had already selected their delegates. The convention at Philadelphia drew up one of the most influential documents of Western world history, the Constitution of the United States. All the states except Rhode Island sent representatives. The delegates mainly came from the wealthier and more conservative ranks of society. The convention immediately set about drawing up a new scheme of government. However, it found itself faced with a rift. The smaller states wanted to retain their power, and the larger states wanted to have power determined by population. It was agreed that the new Congress should be made an effective body, but as to its composition, there was great difference of opinion. The fundamental question was the apportionment of power in the new government. Edmund Randolph offered a plan known variously as the Randolph, the Virginia, or the Large State Plan. It provided for a bicameral legislature, a 2-house legislature, with the lower house elected according to population and the upper house elected by the lower. William Paterson offered the New Jersey or Small State Plan. It provided for equal representation of states in Congress. Neither the large states nor the small states would yield, and for a time it seemed that the convention would fail. Oliver Ellsworth and Roger Sherman put forward a compromise measure that gradually won approval. This provided for a lower house to be elected according to population, the House of Representatives, and an upper house to be chosen by the states, the Senate. The initial compromise diffused the threat of a walkout by the small states, and the convention settled down to complete its task. Slavery was a central consideration in the convention. In the heated debates over representation in the Congress, the question arose as to how and if the slaves should be counted. Most of the Northern delegates could not regard slaves in a light other than property, so they certainly didn't consider them worthy of representation. The Georgia and South Carolina delegates were loud in their demands that blacks be counted equally with the whites. Many Northerners rejected this idea of being placed on equal footing with slaves, while others condemned any proposal that would recognize slavery. The 3/5 Compromise, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, that was finally written, probably didn't please anyone, but demonstrated the power of the pro-slavery interests. Slaves were to be treated as property in assessing taxes, but every 5 slaves would count as 3 people to determine representation. In another compromise, the slave trade was extended for 20 years to the end of 1808. This is Article 2, Section 9 of the Constitution. There were, naturally, many other points of argument, and some of the delegates were so disgusted that they went home and later led the fight in the states against ratification of the Constitution. The convention was in session until September 17, 1787, and the document was then sent to the states for ratification. Delaware ratified it first on December 7th of that year. There were serious struggles in most of the states, especially since the convention had obviously gone beyond its mandate merely to amend the Articles of Confederation. The Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays on the proposed new Constitution of the United States and on the nature of Republican government, published between 1787 and 1788 by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, was an effort to persuade New York State voters to support ratification. The authors of the Federalist Papers presented a defense of the new federal system and of the major departments in the proposed central government. They also argued that the existing government under the Articles of Confederation was defective, and the proposed Constitution would fix its weaknesses without endangering the liberties of the people. The creation and adoption of the Constitution were open to charges that the convention delegates had overstepped their mandate. They had only been authorized to devise improvements to the Articles of Confederation. Instead, the convention produced an entirely new government, and it was to be approved not by the legislatures of the 13 states, as provided in the Articles, but by the people of each state, in specially elected state ratifying conventions, packed in some instances with supporters of the new government. North Carolina and Rhode Island rejected the Constitution, but the majority clause brought the Constitution into force without them by the end of June 1788, and they were later forced to accept it. The Constitution concisely organizes the country's basic political institutions. The main text comprises 7 articles. Article 1 vests all legislative powers in the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Article 2 vests executive power in the office of the Presidency of the United States. The President, selected by an electoral college to serve a 4-year term, is given responsibilities common to chief executives, including serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, negotiating treaties, and granting pardons. The president's vast appointment powers, which include members of the federal judiciary and the cabinet, are subject to the advice and consent majority approval of the Senate. Article 3 places judicial power in the hands of the courts. The Constitution is interpreted by the courts, and the Supreme Court of the United States is the final court of appeal from the state and lower federal courts. Article 4 requires states to recognize the official acts, judicial proceedings, and privileges of citizens of other states. Article 5 stipulates the procedures for amending the Constitution. Amendments may be proposed by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress or by a convention called by Congress on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. Proposed amendments must be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or by conventions in as many states, depending on the decision of Congress. Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for office holders, also deals with public debts and the supremacy of the Constitution, citing the document as the supreme law of the land. Article 7 stipulated that the Constitution would become operational after being ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The creation and ratification of the U.S. Constitution reflected the attempts to create a sustainable order after the Revolution. In some ways, it demonstrates a retreat from the expanding political participation seen during the war and the difficulties of governance. How do you ensure individual liberty, manage political disagreement, and create consistent and fair governance? How do you balance these often competing goals and interests? These questions and these debates they foster are embedded in the Constitution and continue to this day. The last 2 decades of the 18th century were really an age of revolutions. There was, of course, the American Revolution, but there was also the French Revolution and the Saint-Domingue Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, as well. In a sense, the American Revolution and its aftermath marked the most conservative of these revolutions. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, not only propelled all of Europe into war, but also touched off slave uprisings in the Caribbean. On Saint-Domingue, the free people of color began the chain of rebellion when French planters would not grant them citizenship as decreed by the National Assembly of France in its Declaration of the Rights of Man. Beginning in 1791, a bloody 13-year revolution ensued, a complex web of wars among and between slaves, whites, free people of color, France, Spain, the United States, and Great Britain, which would eventually result in the creation of the first independent black nation in the Western world, Haiti. In 1794, France built upon the Declaration of the Rights of Man and officially abolished slavery in its colonies. Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Saint-Domingue Rebellion, joined forces with the French Republic as a brigadier general and turned his troops against Spain. In 1797, Louverture was made commander-in-chief of the island. Following the defeat of both Spanish and British forces, Louverture began moving toward independence from France. With Toussaint Louverture as its governor for life, Saint-Domingue was still technically a French colony, but was acting more and more as an independent state. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had seized power in France in 1799, sought to restore slavery to the West Indies through political guile and military force. Toussaint Louverture was captured and exiled, but the fighting continued under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe. However, Napoleon's plan collapsed when the 12-year revolt of slaves and free blacks in the French colony of Saint-Domingue succeeded. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines proclaimed himself ruler of the new nation, which was called Haiti, a higher place. As Napoleon's New World Empire disintegrated, the loss of Haiti made the French territory of Louisiana in North America unnecessary. The United States wanted to acquire the area near New Orleans, primarily to guarantee its right to sail vessels down the Mississippi River. In addition, the United States wanted to possess the entire territory of Louisiana because so many American settlers and merchants were already in the region. The United States purchased for a total price of $15 million the territory, nearly doubling the size of the United States. Early in the 19th century, while the rapidly growing United States expanded into the lower South, white settlers faced what they considered an obstacle. This area was home to the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. These Indian nations, in the view of the settlers and many other white Americans, were standing in the way of progress. Eager for land to raise cotton, the settlers pressured the federal government to acquire Indian territory. Andrew Jackson, from Tennessee, was a forceful proponent of Indian removal. In 1814, he commanded the U.S. military forces that defeated a faction of the Creek Nation. In their defeat, the Creeks lost 22 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama. In 1823, the Supreme Court handed down a decision which stated that Indians could occupy lands within the United States, but could not hold title to those lands. This was because, in the ruling by the Supreme Court, their right of occupancy, that is, their right to occupy the land, was subordinate, was less than the United States, the nation's right of discovery. In response to the great threat this posed, the Creeks, Cherokee, and Chickasaw instituted policies of restricting land sales to the government. They wanted to protect what remained of their land before it was too late. Although the 5 Indian nations had made earlier attempts at resistance, many of their strategies were nonviolent. One method was to adopt Anglo-American practices such as large-scale farming, Western education, and slaveholding. This earned the nations the designations of the 5 civilized tribes. They adopted this policy of assimilation in an attempt to coexist with settlers and ward off hostility, but it only resulted in making white settlers jealous and resentful. The Cherokee used legal means in their attempts to safeguard their rights. They sought protection from land-hungry white settlers who continually harassed them by stealing their livestock, burning their towns, and squatting on their land. In 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution declaring themselves to be a sovereign nation. They based this on United States policy. In former treaties, Indian nations had been declared sovereign, so they would be legally capable of selling their lands. Now the Cherokee hoped to use this status to their advantage. The Cherokee went to the Supreme Court again in 1831. The court this time decided in favor of the Cherokee. It stated that the Cherokee had the right to self-government and declared Georgia's extension of state law over them to be unconstitutional. The state of Georgia refused to abide by the court decision, however, and President Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. In 1830, just a year after taking office, Jackson pushed a new piece of legislation called the Indian Removal Act through both houses of Congress. It gave the president power to negotiate removal treaties with Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi. Under these treaties, the Indians were to give up their lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for lands to the west, the recently acquired Louisiana territory. For the next 28 years, the United States government forced the relocation of the southeastern nations. The Cherokee, for example, were tricked with an illegitimate treaty. The Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily, at the end of which time they would be forcibly removed. In that time, by 1838, only 2,000 had migrated. 16,000 remained on their land. The U.S. government sent in 7,000 troops who forced the Cherokee into stockades at Bayonet Point. They were not allowed time to gather their belongings, and as they left, whites looted their homes. Then began the march known as the Trail of Tears, in which 4,000 Cherokee people died of cold, hunger, and disease on their way to the western lands. Most members of the 5 southeastern nations were relocated west, opening 25 million acres of land to white settlement and to slavery. The large-scale migration of both whites and forced migration of African American slaves was created largely by both national and international economic forces, resulting in the mechanization of weaving. Great Britain, on average, imported each year about 7 million pounds of cotton fiber through the 1770s. By 1821, Great Britain was importing 93 million pounds of raw cotton from the United States alone. During this time period, the price of cotton is steadily climbing from 25 cents a pound in 1790 to 44 cents a pound in 1800, when, according to one estimate, a planter could turn a profit with cotton selling it for about 12 cents a pound. Eli Whitney's creation of a new cotton gin made the expansion inland in the South possible and encouraged the development of and planting of different varieties of a shorter staple cotton. The machine, with its rotating wire teeth, ripped seeds away from the lint and did it fairly rapidly. One person could hand seed, that is, take out the seed from the cotton fiber. One person could achieve this and wind up with about a pound of cotton at the end of the day. That same person, with the simplest of Whitney's devices, could gin 50 pounds of the same fiber in a day's time, and workers using improved models could gin even more. As land opened up through purchase, treaty, and defeat of the Native American populations, more and more whites and their slaves poured into the new territories. The result of this boom, of course, is the huge forced migration of African Americans, not only from Africa, but also from within the United States to the lower South. Between 1783 and 1808, the last quarter of a century of the external slave trade, well over 100,000 Africans, roughly 20% of all those who were brought to what became the United States, were brought into the nation. It appears that the vast majority of slaves who found themselves migrating to the Deep South did so in the earlier period, before 1808, as a result of their owners migrating. After this time period, after 1808, and with the growing boom in cotton, it seems clear that the majority of African Americans found themselves thrust into an interregional trade in slaves, in which slaves of the Upper South and the Atlantic coastal area were generally sold southward and westward into the Lower South. The expansion of the United States involved a complex set of factors and events linking Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. This movement west linked two revolutions to the forced removal of indigenous populations, technological innovation to the spread and entrenchment of slavery. The rise of cotton reflected changes in the lives of Native Americans, African Americans, white Americans, the English, the French, and Haitians. These changes marked a significant shift in the societies and economies of each people and each nation.